Hey, this is John. Thanks so much for joining me for part 4 of this build of Bandai's HGUC RX-78-2. This episode will take a look at painting and finishing the inner frame parts. Now, any of the HG kits you build are generally going to have a fairly simple inner frame so that there may not be a lot of detail to paint, but there will be some that shows when the kit is fully assembled, and so we're going to go through some simple steps that you can take to maximize what is there, make it look kind of cool, and have fun along the way. Now, if you're planning on brush painting your inner frame, then you'll want to prime it in whatever color you're going to prime it in, and just do your normal brush paint. I would recommend using fairly thin coats. You want to get 2 or 3 coats on so that it doesn't clog up any detail and inhibit the fit at all. But you'll want to get in your hand painted coats, and then the steps after that will mirror what I'm going to demonstrate in this video. I'll be painting my parts with an airbrush. Now, whether you're painting with an airbrush or you're hand brushing it, or maybe you're using a rattle can, all work equally well. Make sure that as you paint, that you paint any moving parts in all of their positions. My preference is to paint the part when it's fully articulated, like this, and then once that dries, I'll put it back into place and then paint anything that's left. For parts that are static, of course, you just paint them once and you're good to go. But once the paint is on, then we'll take some additional steps to highlight and shadow them and just maybe give them a few touches of color to add some visual interest. Okay, as I briefly demonstrated in the previous episode of this series, to get the parts ready to paint, I like to use these clips to hold them on, and all I do is look for a place on the part that's not going to be painted if I can find it. Like on this arm, I'll just clip it on the end of the peg there where it's going to go into the shoulder socket. For this leg part here, this part right there will slip into a poly cap, and so I'll just clip that on right there. For his backpack, this part will be flush up against the model, and so these pegs, doesn't matter if they're painted or not, so I'll clip it on that. Now, sometimes you may have trouble finding a place to clip the peg, and in those cases you may have to use a pair of tweezers to hold the part while you paint, or put in a small piece of blue tack and stick a cocktail stick into it or something like that. For really small pieces that I'm not going to be able to mount up, that I know that I'm going to have to hold with tweezers while I'm painting it, I just put them together in a little plastic cup like this, just to make sure that I keep them all together, because they're generally very small, and that'll hold them in place so that you don't lose them and they're not rattling around loose. Okay, the paint I'm going to be using for this build is Mr. Color's Gundam Color MS Phantom Gray. UG15 is the code number. This is, I guess you'd say, Canon color. It's going to pretty much match the plastic, just about exactly. And you can paint your frame however you want. There's as many ways of painting frames as there are people. I've painted them one color and dry brushed them with another, and then hit them with a clear coat of something else, a metallic clear coat. I've picked completely different colors than Canon colors for painting frames. It's up to you. For this build, just to keep it simple, I'm going to go with Canon colors. And if you like using lacquer paints, these are very, very, very good paints to use. Okay, I have all of the frame parts mounted up on a cat scratch pad. They're all on clips, as you can see. I keep them segregated into, this is the left side, this is the right side, and this is the anything that's torso or not handed in any way. On this kit, it's fairly easy to figure out which is the left and right side. Some kits, it's a little more difficult. So keeping them separated in this way will help you when you reassemble later. But I'm going to go off camera and I'm going to just simply airbrush these parts with this paint that I just showed you. And I'm going to be using my Badger Patriot Extreme airbrush that has a 0.3 nozzle. I'll set my PSI at about 18 PSI. I'll thin the paints. I've got other videos on this channel that talk about airbrushing and thinning paints, so if you need some help with that, look that up. And I'll come back and show you the painted parts and what I'm going to do after that. One quick note I wanted to bring up, just I guess you'd say some editorial addition. This kit has a fairly simple frame, as I mentioned. Most high-grade kits, which are 1/144 scale, they have a fairly simple inner frame. If you go up to the larger scales or to the RG line, the real grade line of Gunpla, which are also 1/144 scale, they have a much more detailed frame. And as these photos that I have playing along, I guess you'd say, in the background show, the larger scale frames have much more detail and can be painted up in a much better fashion. So if you look at this and say, gee, that looks kind of basic, I don't know if I want to build one of these, keep in mind this is just a fairly basic starter kit that for the purposes of a start to finish video build works really well. But there are much more detailed kits available. So keep that in mind if you're looking for you know, a little more painting value, I guess you'd say, in the inner frame. While this kit may be a good one to start with to just kind of get the basic experience, once you move on to larger scale or the more detailed real grade kits, there's going to be a lot more to paint. All right, I have all the parts painted. I'm not going to show all of them again because, well, they basically all look like this. But what I want to use these parts for is to demonstrate a variety of ways that you can finish the inner frame on your Gundam build, on your Gunpla. Each of these techniques that I'm going to show may not be in place on every build. If you're going for a cleaner look, a more precise look, then some of the things I do may not be preferred. Then again, if you're going to be going for more of a grungy, grimy look, a little less precise look, then that may dictate what you're going to do. But I think showing some of these basic foundational methods will help you as you're building Gunpla to be able to really execute on plastic what you kind of envision in your head that you want it to look like. Okay, the first thing I want to demonstrate is a tried and true simple technique of dry brushing. Now, what dry brushing is going to do for you is it's going to bring out various edges and angles, things like that, so that essentially somebody looking at it can see the features of the model, even if they're viewing it from a distance. It can also suggest wear, scraping, tear. Depending on the color, it can suggest rust or grime. But in this case, I'm just going to be doing it principally to bring out the details. Now, if I'm doing a general dry brush of a solid color like this, I like to do that general dry brush before painting any other details. I can go back later if I paint other details and I want those to be dry brushed. I can do a more discreet dry brush. But I find that I like doing a general dry brushing first so that I don't have to be precise, don't have to worry about hitting things I don't want to hit. I just get all of it and then go back and fill in the rest of the details, if you know what I mean. Now, for this dry brushing, I'm going to be using Vallejo Model Color Sky Gray 70989. This is my favorite color for dry brushing. It works in so many ways. and works well with so many colors. You don't have to use a light gray. You can pick the color you want, of course, but this is a good one to use. Now for the brushes, for this one I'm going to be using this makeup brush. It's a great brush for doing dry brushing. It's very fluffy, distributes paint really well, doesn't leave a lot of streaks if you're careful with it. So it can be a really useful one, and they're cheap, easy to pick up. Now you may not have one of those, so certainly just any flat brush, flat brushes work best, will work. If you're working in a larger area, then a larger brush. If smaller area, then this smaller brush. And both of these are fairly soft. They're not particularly stiff. Very stiff brushes can be easier to dry brush with in some cases, but they may take off the underlying paint, so be aware of that. When I dry brush, I don't ever thin my paint. I use it right out of the paint bottle. And all I'm going to do is dip in the tip of my brush, and I'm going to work it off on this paper towel. Now if you're using a big fluffy brush like this, you've got to be real careful to get off as much of that paint as you can. It holds paint really well, which is good. But if you go in and you start dry brushing and you haven't unloaded it enough, there may be too much paint on it and you'll get some results you don't want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually test this on the back of the model. And yeah, that's looking like I want. It's a good way to do it. Test it where it's not going to be seen. And now I just go in and I start hitting those edges. Now, depending on how much of an effect you want, you can bear down on it a little more. You can go over it more times. The beauty of dry brushing is the only mistake you can really make is having too much paint on your brush. So if you do that, go back, unload some more of the paint. If you need to make some corrections on the model, on the base paint, go ahead and do that. But I'm just going to go through and dry brush this part. I'm going to pop out the exhausts, the jet nozzles, so that I can get well into those areas. And I apologize if this is off camera. I shoot this on my cell phone, and because of the angle it's at and glare on it, I sometimes have trouble seeing if I'm in focus. So if this is not in focus, I profusely apologize. But you get the gist of it. And most of you, I'm betting, have done this. So this is not certainly a new technique. In fact, a lot of people think this is too basic of a technique, but I like using it. I think it works well in a lot of cases. But very quickly, I've made that detail pop out, and hopefully you can see how that's improved the look. And now I can go back in and begin painting some other details. Now, I'll go back through the other parts and dry brush them, and then we'll move on to some other techniques. All right, another simple technique to just add visual interest to your Gunpla build is to make use of slight color variations for certain parts. By that I mean, this, being all one color looks really cool, but if you give it just a little bit of a slight variation, it can often increase the visual interest and draw the viewer's eye to particular details. So what I want to do here is I want to get some of this Vallejo model color neutral gray, which is a very close color to this phantom gray that I painted the base. But what I want to do is I just want to get a little bit on my palette here. And then this I'm going to thin down. I'm going to use a little bit of Vallejo's airbrush thinner. And I'm going to put in a drop of that. And then I'm going to use a drop of Vallejo's airbrush flow improver. And if you're not using Vallejo paints, you can thin those with whatever you are comfortable with. It doesn't have to be these particular products. And then I'm going to take my brush and I'm going to give it a stir. Make sure that it's a good consistency. I want a consistency when I'm brush painting in general that's going to require me 2 to 3 coats to get good coverage. That way it's a nice smooth paint result. And what I'm going to do, when I do the initial mixing, I like to clean my brush off of the excess paint. And then licking my brush, I'll go back in and get just a little bit on the end of it. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and I'm just going to paint this area here on all sides, because I want it to be just slightly distinct from the rest of it. Now, normally I would be up much closer and doing a much faster job of painting this, but doing this on camera takes a little bit more, a little different approach. So if it looks a little wonky, that's why. But I'm going to continue on and get both sides painted, and I'll show you what those look like. Okay, I've got things dry brushed and painted, and I just wanted to point out a few things. You'll notice on this backpack here, I painted these areas, and you see there's just a little bit of a tonal variation. Now I'll go back in with my sky gray, and I'll just do a light dry brush of those edges to help pop those out. But it gives just a little bit of a visual difference. And you don't have to use something so close to the base color. I could have done this in a blue gray, a reddish color. I could have painted it white. You can be canon, meaning by canon I mean you can use the colors that are shown in the anime or in the book or whatever is the source material for the Gunpla, or you can just go off what you want. This is pretty much me just making it up as I go along. So I've got that done that way. The hand I just dry brushed, but I'm going to go back and I'm going to do some other steps to that. You'll see here on this handle for the shield, I painted this neutral gray right in the middle. It just provides some separation between those two parts and helps show the detail. I did the same thing on the leg here. That middle part of the joint, I just painted the neutral gray so that it'll give some, I guess you'd say, reward to the viewer when they look in close to see what further detail. Now here on the foot part, I didn't actually dry brush this. I'm going to be doing a lot more detail painting. This is one of the few pieces on the inner frame that has a lot of detail. And you'll notice I started off, it's got the base color, and then I have the neutral gray, and then I actually painted the tops of the piston sky gray. And then a little later on in this video, I'm going to go back in with some additional colors and talk about making choices there. But when you're doing the initial painting on a frame, doing the dry brushing and just some slight tonal variations to the inner frame pieces can really add to the visual interest of the final product. Another thing I wanted to cover just briefly that has more to do with the general aesthetic of building Gundam and Gunpla kits is the use of metallic paints on the inner frame, sometimes on the external armor, but certainly on the inner frames. And you'll see it a lot. It's not necessarily part of the anime, so it's not necessarily strictly canon, but in terms of what you see many builders doing, and I guess you'd say just sort of an accepted and liked thing, is making use of those metallic colors. Now I have several that I like using. For silvers, my favorite is Citadel's Lead Belcher. I like using it a lot. There's other silvers that you can use, but I find this one works really well as an initial base. For gold, I like to use Citadel Retributor Armor. It's a very strong, very punchy gold, and looks really cool. For bronze, bronze is one of my favorite colors to use in the inner frame of a Gunpla. Balthasar Gold, even though it's called gold, it's actually bronze, is a great color to have on hand. Other colors, especially for things like pistons and piping and stuff like that, I like to use this ammo of MiG Warhead Metallic Blue. You'll see that on many of my Gunpla builds. I really like it. I also like Metallic Red from the same maker. They also make a Metallic Orange and other metallic colors, but these are two of my favorites. that are really nice looking. You can also paint, quite often I've painted something on the model silver, and then I'll go over it with some of the Tamiya clear colors, like this clear orange. I have all of their clear colors. They have yellow and red and blue and green, and I think there may be some others. But these look really nice painted over silver. So making use of metallic colors is a cool part of doing your internal frame. You don't have to, but it's something I like to add in. So I thought I would demonstrate just how it looks on a few of the parts. I really like to paint some of the inner frame using a bronze color, especially these giant bolt-looking things. For some reason, to me, they just look really nice when done in a bronze color. So I've got some of the Citadel Balthazar gold loaded up on my palette here, and it's not going to be anything earth-shattering, but I'm simply going to try and get that on camera. I'm simply going to paint this like that. And this is a really, really punchy color. Now, what I've done is I've left that middle part. Let's see if I can get it in focus. I'm trying, I really am. I've left that middle part unpainted so that it just looks like, I don't know, I don't guess a giant screwdriver would go into it, but just so that that makes it distinct. And I'm going to go around and just paint the edge here. But I think the use of metallic colors like this just really gives a frame a nice look, especially in those larger scales when they've got loads of detail on them. I think it just really gives them a nice look. This one doesn't have a lot of detail on it, but I thought that would be a neat point to put out, and I'll go back into some shading later on with that. But that's how the bronze will look on any of the frame parts. Another color that I'll use with some frequency is anything silver. It can be a bright silver, a light silver, gunmetal kind of silver. I like generally to use Citadel's lead belcher as the basis for most of the silver work that I do. So I thought on this backpack I would go in and paint this just like that. And I want to, in this case, paint the middle of that because I'm going to shade that, and I want the shininess of the silver to be there. Sometimes I do things when I'm building Gunpla and I'm painting them with a logical, you know, it's this way because of this reason. And sometimes I just do it, I let the rule of cool take over, and I do it because I think it looks cool. And sometimes when you're building a model, that's good enough. So I'm going to come back and do some more with that, but I'll show you that. And but I'll leave that as the basis for that. The other thing I use lead belcher for is these little jet nozzles. And if I can get this in focus, I will be shocked. But I'm going to give it a base coat of this lead belcher. There's still more to do with this, but I want to start it off with lead belcher. And you can use, you know, it's up to you. You can use a gunmetal color. Whoops, I just went totally off camera. You can use a gunmetal color. You can use silver. You could decide that yours are going to be red or purple or whatever. It's up to you. Be very Bob Ross about your Gunpla painting. You know, it's paint yourself the equivalent of happy little clouds and happy little trees and things like that. Do what you like, and but I like doing it this way, and so I'll let that dry and show you some additional steps that I like to take with jet nozzles like this. Another thing I find really fun when I'm painting any of my Gunpla kits is pistons. You'll notice that This one has just some little small piston detail right there on the front of the foot. And what I generally like to do with these is the piston itself, I'll usually paint silver using lead belcher. And then the part that the piston goes into, the piston thingy holder socket thingy. What I like to do with those is paint them a bright red or blue or orange color, depending on the colors on the mobile suit. And I try to do some color wheel theory. You know, if a mobile suit has a lot of green in it, I'll use maybe some red. If it's got a lot of blue, I'll use some orange. You know, just matching across the color wheel. Because this one is, the RX-78-2 is almost all primary colors, I thought I'd just go with red. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off painting the pistons themselves with this silver. Now I'm probably going to make some mistakes here because I'm trying to do this on camera. Can he get it on camera? There. It's probably back off camera because I'm having to look at it, and I apologize. I'm probably going to make some mistakes because I'm having to do this at a distance. But you get the idea. You paint the piston like that. You need a little bit more paint. And then I don't even wait for that to dry. I just quickly clean my brush off, lick it one time, and I go right into my Ammo of MiG metallic red. Now I painted these gray earlier with a purpose in mind. This Ammo of MiG paint really shines when there's a lighter color behind it. It doesn't necessarily need to be metallic, but just a lighter color like this. Will really look nice. I apologize that I keep drifting off camera. It's really difficult to get this close in, but I wanted to show this because I think this is one of the really fun aspects of gunpla building, is the creativity that you can apply and just applying different colors and things that, you know, as a guy who built aircraft for many years, I didn't get to use all these shiny colors, and I've really enjoyed being able to do that. So you can see it gives a really, really nice look, and it'll dry about that shiny. You have to give it plenty of time to dry. I didn't thin this at all. The Ammo of MiG paints, they have plenty of Spanish water in them that makes them really thin. So you can use them right out of the bottle for brush painting. Okay, the exhaust nozzles have had time to dry, and I could, at this point, dry brush it with a lighter silver color, such as Citadel's Runefang Steel, which is a color I like using for dry brushing over lead belcher. But I've started doing something in the last few builds that I think gives it a more interesting look. I do what's called what would essentially be called sponge chipping. I take a piece of sponge, hold it in my tweezers, dip it into the paint. You see I got some there on the end, and I offload it onto this piece of paper towel until it's given me a fairly sparse pattern like that. And then I go in and I just apply this onto the jet nozzle. Now, it's going to be very subtle here on this piece, and because it's so small, this is not going to show up real well. This is going to be something that really pops on larger jet nozzles and in larger scales. But what it's doing is it's giving some tonal variation, kind of a scratch look to it. I don't know if this will even show up on camera because this part is so small, but I'm going to be doing the same thing. I'm planning for the next episode of this series to be finishing the weapons, And I'll show you this in much greater detail on that. But it just gives it a really cool look, I think, of being used in, you know, that it's been abused and heat stained and all of that. So I do that, and you can even go back over it. You can get bonus points if you flip your sponge around and go back into the lead belcher and add some more on top of it, so there's some darker contrast. And you can use more than just a couple of colors. Oops, sorry about that. You can use more than just a couple of colors. And it doesn't have to be silvers, but it gives it a really cool look. So I'll let that dry and show you one more step that will wrap up this video. Okay, the last step I'm going to take for this video is to add in some shading. Now I'm going to use Citadel's Known Oil because I like using this because it's an acrylic product. Bandai's plastic, it's good stuff, but the reason it fits so well is they don't put it through a final baking process which hardens it. That's why on traditional models you can use enamel thinners and it won't hurt them. Enamel thinners that get into the joints of a Gunpla will break the parts. It does cause problems. You can do it, but I felt like for this video aimed at someone who's just doing this for the first time, you don't want to have to go through the frustration of dealing with that. So just for a basic, simple build, and this is a technique I actually use a lot. It's not like I'm showing you something I don't use. I use this a lot because I like it and it works. But I'm just going to go over it with the basic Citadel Known Oil. This is not the gloss product. This is just the standard Known Oil right out of the pot. Now you could use other colors. You don't have to use this Known Oil, but I like it because it gives contrast, it's quick, and it dries very fast. But I'm just going to go over and just paint the whole thing. I'm not going to leave anything out. Now I don't want it to pool in too many areas. I don't want it to be obvious drips, but I don't mind if it's a little thicker in some areas than others, as long as it looks organic to the mobile suit. Now I'm going to go ahead and paint over that so that it'll get that centerpiece that I'd left unpainted. But then after my brush gets a little bit unloaded on these other parts, I'm going to clean it off on my sleeve. Hope my wife doesn't see that. And I apologize for being horribly off camera there. I get going and I just stop and I don't even stop and look at the camera. But I'll just paint all of these parts. I don't know what happened to my clip for this one. That's okay. I'll just paint all of these parts with this Known Oil. And what that's going to do, it's going to unify some of the colors. It's going to highlight, or it's going to increase the shadows a little bit. Everything we've been doing up until now has pretty much been adding some kind of highlight, some kind of bright point. This is going to pop out the shadows, make the parts be more distinct, because between this and the dry brushing, you'll end up with some really cool distinct edges. And as you're going along doing this, if it is not looking right to you, quickly dip your brush in water and get off any of the excess. You can start over. If bad comes to worse, just repaint it. But I'll continue doing this across these parts that we've been working on and show you what it looks like. Okay, I've added a coat of Known Oil to all of the demonstrator internal parts. And it really helps the detail pop out. You can see on this jet nozzle now that that shade is in there. It looks like it's been used. Towards the end I'll go put some burn defects on there, and we'll cover that in another video, but that's a good basis for weathering that. On the foot parts, adding that shade in really helped pop out the detail and just makes the various parts that are cast in stand out when somebody's given some closer examination. That little red right there will draw somebody's attention, and when they get in there to look a little closer, they'll be rewarded with some extra detail. So it really helps in that way. It helps the hands look a little more distinct between the joints and the features of the palm. Got it on the backpack here, and you can see how that's looking. I'll probably go back and make a second application to some of the recesses along this just so that it's a little more distinct. But you can adjust that based on your own tastes. And here's this part, which I've also given a coat of Nuln oil, and it helps pull the detail out. So the use of a shade, it's not a requirement. It's not something you have to do. It's just a way of making the details pop out a little more. You can be more precise in your application. You can be generous about it like I was here. It depends on the goal that you're going for with your particular model. But they're a great thing to make use of in building your Gunpla. I think I'm going to call this video done. I know it went a little longer than the previous ones in this series, but I wanted to make sure to thoroughly cover some techniques that you can use in painting and detailing your frame. Now, keep in mind, this is not an exhaustive list of things that can be done. It's not the only thing that you can do. There are loads more techniques that you can apply. I just thought these were some of the more simple ones so that if you're new to this and you're just looking for just some basic suggestions on how do I make this thing look a little better than just painted plastic, doing these things and using them as the foundation for other things will really improve the look of your finished model. So use these not as the final list, but as the jumping off point for the work that you do on your future Gunpla. With all that said, thank you so much for watching this video, and for subscribing. I hope you've done that. Please do subscribe to this channel and click the little bell icon so that you'll be notified as new episodes in this series come out and other videos that I do. If you're already following me on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. Please do visit my blog, johnbias.com. I would be grateful for that. And finally, I've got to say a special thanks to the folks who have stepped up on Patreon to support me there. If you're not familiar with that, it's a way that you can support your favorite Gunpla artists, and maybe me too. So there's some rewards there. There's going to be links in the description below. Please check that out, and I would be most grateful if you considered supporting me in the work that I do. But with all that said, I hope you have fun building your Gunpla and working on the inner frame. And in the next episode, I plan to show you what I do to paint and finish the weapons. So until that time, happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.